Okay. Right. First item, apologies for absence. Have we had any apologies?
Just received the one apology from Councillor Croker.
Right, okay. You've seen the minutes of the last meeting. Can I have your approval to sign these as a true record?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Agreed.
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 Right, thank you. Have any councillors got any declarations of interest to make for this meeting? Okay. Announcements. So I'm just losing the screen here. As you all know, Leonard died recently, and a full tribute will be made at the next full council meeting. But as he was chairman of this committee until very recently, I felt it appropriate to make a few remarks. I did not serve with Leonard on this committee, but I've known him for about 25 years. And in 1998, we were both appointed to the Housing Options Subcommittee, which is the body that paved the way for the establishment of Saxon Weald by transferring the council's general housing stock. Leonard and I were both initially sceptical about the need to do this, and his forensic questioning focused everyone's minds on the key issue, which was that the council could not afford to provide quality social housing. Once Leonard was convinced by the argument, he was a critical friend of the proposal, championing it to members who remained sceptical, while still challenging details from committee. Working with Leonard, I came to respect both his strategic overview and his capacity to absorb detail. And it's these abilities which I feel sure this committee and the council as a whole will surely miss. Is there any other member wishing to make any tribute to Leonard at this time? Okay. Right, let's move on to the, sorry, are there any other announcements? No. Right, let's move on to item 5, carbon reduction target and action plan. Philip, are you going to lead on this?
Yes. Yes, I will, Chairman. There'll be an introduction and then we'll go into a presentation. If I could start, Chairman, by I'm not a member of, obviously, of your committee, but I would echo your comments about Councillor Leonard Crosby, who I had the privilege, and it was a privilege, to serve as deputy, as vice chairman when he was chairman. And I'm very glad the council sensibly decided quite rightly that the chairmanship was a non-political position and chose Leonard to be the chairman of the council, a role that he fulfilled with great distinction. And I was very proud to be his deputy as vice chairman. Now, moving on to the issue of the carbon reduction strategy, this has been pretty widely discussed now, and we discussed it, as some of you will know, at my recent PDAG. We also had a briefing that was open to all members on the subject. And we, of course, have tonight, but we also have the cabinet meeting on Thursday, when the issue will be a major part of the agenda. What we are trying to do is give effect to the motion that was passed. I remember for Horsham District Council, it was quite a hotly and I was going to say excitedly, but a hotly debated motion. And we as an administration, want to give effect to what was agreed that evening in the motion and to respond to the public concern on this issue. And we feel that what we're going to put before you this evening does that. Now, I believe that what we are putting before you and what we'll be putting before Cabinet on Thursday is an ambitious programme of carbon reduction. Now, why do I say that? I say that for a number of reasons. One is because it has better or more ambitious targets than a number of other local authorities. Secondly, we are doing this at a time of considerable uncertainty over the council's finances. Those who've been in local government for a long time, many of them feel that this is actually the most uncertain period for local government finance that we've ever experienced, for reasons I don't have to go into. But it does mean there is considerable agonized discussions about how we're going to maintain basic frontline services and all the services that we provide for residents. Also, we're doing this at a time of considerable uncertainty in terms of local government organisation. Now, we now believe, and I don't want anyone to quote me on this, but we now believe we might be seeing the 16th government U-turn this year. But a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at the very distinct possibility that we would be seeing a complete recasting of local government that was going to be foreshadowed in the white paper later this month or early next month. So we were doing all the work on this against the backcloth of the distinct possibility that Horsham District Council might be setting off this process, but not actually be able to see it through because we wouldn't exist. It now looks as if the government has changed its mind on this issue from what we hear, and therefore maybe we're in a more certain position in respect of organisational issues. We are looking at a very considerable cost. I mean, we are looking at the potential of spending £20 million over the next 10 years, and 20 million against our budget, 20 million against the struggle we are going to have, certainly in the short term, in terms of financing our basic public services. Well, it's going to be challenging. The point I've always made, and I made in the original debate on the motion, is that we have to carry people with us. In that sense, as a public authority, a democratically elected public authority answerable to the public, we are in a more difficult position than many of the campaigning organisations who lobby us about taking action. They don't have, to the same extent, the need to carry the public with them. We do as elected representatives of a public authority. The final comment in this introduction, Chairman, I wanted to make is there may be people who will say, well, couldn't we do this? Couldn't we do that? Couldn't we be slightly more ambitious about this aspect? And what I would say to you is this. This is an aspirational target. And what that means, amongst other things, is that we have the ability to change and modify what is unfolding as circumstances dictate. And we will be looking, the idea is that we will look at what we are doing on this front every year as part of the budget review process. And so it will be, I just say to those who might think that on certain aspects we could maybe be more ambitious or change this or change that, that this will be a process that is under constant review as we move forward. So I do want that point to be understood. Now I'm going to hand over to Helen and Adam. Helen Peacock. Helen Peacock has given this presentation so many times, Chairman, I imagine she can probably give it in her sleep. But she does a very excellent presentation, making the issues and challenges very clear. And I'd like now, Chairman, to hand over to Helen.
Okay, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that okay, and hear me fine as well. Okay, so following on from Philip's useful, very, very useful introduction as to where we are now in terms of an organisation and our aspirations to reduce our carbon emissions, I'll run through, oh, sorry, seem to have got a technical issue. I apologise. That's better. Okay. So the work that we've been doing with a consultant to help us to understand our carbon targets and also set out an action plan, it stems from some work that we did last year in terms of our carbon footprint for 2018-19. And the reason that I'm giving you all of this information is it very, very useful to understand our different carbon emissions, where they come from, and that then directly relates to the two different targets that are being recommended at Cabinet on Thursday. So something called Scope 1 emissions are the ones that are directly within our control, and they are gas used in our buildings, our operational buildings, and the fuel that's used in our fleet. Scope 2, again, more directly within our control, in that it's our electricity that we use in our buildings, and also any electric vehicles that we have in our fleet. So those two come to about 19% of our overall carbon footprint, as I say, for 2018-19. Scope 3 are emissions that are less within our control. So they're water consumption, business travel, and the largest are contracts for procuring our goods and services, and also the fuel used in our leased buildings and power used in our leased buildings. Overall, that comes to 81% of our carbon emissions. And one of the things that I should stress is we've started to look at the 1920 data for our carbon emissions, and the consultants that we've been working with to help us set targets found some anomalies in the 2018-19 data. So we're looking at that to update that information. But having had a conversation with them, I'm reassured by them that that won't affect where we're going in terms of trajectory and also the type of actions that we would look to take. So in understanding the type of target that we wanted to take, they looked at 3 different methodologies for setting a target and compared those to the business as usual scenario. So that's obviously if we weren't to take any action, where would the council stand, what their carbon profile looks like. And then that was compared to 3 different methodologies: an absolute target, which is just a linear reduction to a target date with an annual reduction every year. Science-based targets and the Tyndall pathway are more associated with a more rigorous sort of scientific approach, if you like, much more aligned to the Paris Agreement, which you may or may not recall, relates to setting a target for carbon emissions that mean that global temperatures do not rise above a certain point. So even by that explanation, you can see that they're much more difficult to articulate. So this is the graph that the consultants put together to help us understand what the different targets could look like using those different forms of methodology. You'll see the grey on this chart relates to the business as usual, and that's primarily a reduction that would come through decarbonisation of the electricity grid. As you may know, there's a lot more renewables coming on stream, for example, which basically means that the grid itself is being decarbonised. We've got less coal-powered fire stations, which are particularly carbon intensive as well. Despite that, if the council were not to take any action at all, you can see that the gap by both 2030 and 2050 would still be quite considerable. The solid lines in the brown and the orange are the absolute targets. So as I suggested, that's a linear reduction to either 2030 or 2050. And the dotted lines are the science-based targets, which are much more complicated and relate to carbon budgets and the council not going over certain carbon budgets. So with that in mind, the consultant that we work with is known as Antithesis, and they set out two parts to a suggested target for the council. And this goes back to what I was saying to you earlier in terms of explaining what Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are. So they're suggesting a separate target that relates to those two types of emissions, and they're emissions that are more directly within our control. As I say, they're the gas, the electricity that we use in our operational buildings, and the fuel that we use in our fleet. They're recommending that linear reduction to an absolute target. So that gives us a specific date that we're aiming for, as Philip suggested, aspirational targets. This means that it's very easy to understand, it's easy to articulate. We can look at how our annual reduction is, how well we're succeeding with our annual reduction. And the other aspect with this as well is that it allows us to do something called offsetting, which basically means that we can do things like invest in renewable forms of energy or nature-based solutions, such as restoring heathland, which locks in carbon. Actually, science-based targets are generally used by the private sector and less common in terms of councils to be using those. So they looked at different target dates and for this, and you can see from just a very quick overview of this, the figures on the right-hand side where the yellow arrows, that's our total target carbon budget. And actually, in a lot of ways, that's much more important than the actual target date. So you'll see from this that 2030, 2040, 2050, unsurprisingly, the budget gets larger the longer we wait to reach carbon neutrality. And so basically the 2050 target as total carbon budget would be quite high. So the consultants have recommended a 2030 date to reach carbon neutrality. And they felt this demonstrates leadership, which goes back to what Philip was saying about, having ambition. It requires immediate action, and I think that's probably one of the most important benefits. 2050 targets mean that, it may not mean that we were taking action quite so quickly. It does maximise some financial benefits. Obviously, we would have longer payback periods for certain initiatives, and it could future-proof us as well against changes in legislation or increases in energy costs, for example. But the most obvious disadvantages are massive impact in terms of budget, particularly where the council now finds itself financially. And there is obviously important implications for staff resources as well in terms of trying to take action at pace and scale. And there could be some difficulties in terms of technology and infrastructure. Things like electric vehicles, maybe not so much, that technology is more known now, but there may be other instances where the infrastructure is less readily available and there may be more upfront costs the sooner that we move. Overall, by setting that type of target, we'd be looking at an 8% annual reduction in emissions. I strongly suspect that it will not be a linear reduction and that we will see years where we're not taking as much action and others where we manage to surge forward. So the second part of the recommendation from Antithesis was also to set a separate target for our Scope 3 emissions. And as I say, these are the ones that are less directly within our control and primarily relate to leased buildings and the procuring of goods and services, 81% of our emissions. again, an absolute target to that 2050 date, which again allows us to offset. The important thing to note about the 2050 date is that matches the national target, which is set in legislation. And so we would be running alongside what was happening nationally, which I think is probably quite important, particularly in terms of leased buildings, where there's already legislation in place. The useful part about setting a target for this, even though it is a longer term target, is it gives us an opportunity to influence other organisations. So for example, for our supply chain, we'd be wanting to work with our suppliers, particularly the larger suppliers, but actually SMEs as well, small and medium-sized enterprises that may struggle. And that allows us to also make the connection to reducing the district-wide emissions as well. So this graph here just gives you an overview of what the breakdown in terms of actions that we could take as a council at a very high level. And it indicates, as you can see from here, so over 1,000 tonnes coming from introducing low emission vehicles into the fleet. That actually gives us the biggest reduction from our emissions that were within our direct control. The grey gives you the national picture, that's grid decarbonisation, and you'll see on the right-hand side of the graph, the green and the blue are actions that we would be taking to either introduce green electricity or offsetting through things like nature-based solutions that I was saying to you earlier about heathland or maybe some tree planting, that kind of thing. So that helps to give you an indication of the amount of carbon reductions from roughly from each of the types of measures. And underneath in the orange is a very high level cost estimate of how much they are likely to cost, primarily capital, where there is some revenue in that as well, actually. So what I've done here is just give you that in a slightly possibly more accessible form, and that also includes the scope 3 as well. So it comes to 33 million. The 20 is where Philip was just referring to the scope 1 and 2 over the next 10 years. I think one of the things we need to stress here is these are very high level. The consultants didn't have access to much detailed data. So for example, in terms of property, one of the first things that we'd want to do is carry out audits of some of our main buildings so that we can understand the costs in more detail. And then as Philip was rightly saying, we would then be reporting that annually to determine what actions we would want to be able to take and how that could be funded through the budget. I think the other thing to note from this as well, it doesn't include savings and whole life costs. So for example, with electric vehicles, they are more expensive at the moment. That's likely to come down, I'm sure, but they are much cheaper to run and maintain. And it doesn't include the fact that we are very hopeful that we would be able to secure external sources of funding. Nevertheless, it would be a strain on the budget for the council. So for example, the government is conscious that the public sector requires support in this area and has already introduced the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund, which is there to help us retrofit buildings. So that's things like heating controls, new heating systems, lighting, that kind of thing. So I think the executive summary was circulated to you, and in the cabinet report there's a link to the full report, which is over 120 pages long. So those of you that want to see a bit more detail, that's already available on the council website. But to keep the momentum, what I've done from that is pull out some actions for the next sort of 18 months to 2 years to set us off. This basically means that we can actually hit the ground running. There are some projects here that lay the foundation for future work. And also you'll see from this first sort of set of bullet points, things around awareness raising with staff, which will obviously be an important part of taking this agenda forward. So carbon literacy training so that they can understand how that might impact in terms of their day-to-day work. You'll see it mentions green commuting, obviously not a significant issue at the moment, and also business travel, but obviously in the future that may well be. I think more important, but I think also it's the signal with those kind of initiatives basically that the council is engaged with this particular issue. And obviously we want to make sure that we were communicating with both staff and members about the actions that were being taken. So digging into a little bit more of the detail in terms of transport, route optimization of the refuse vehicles, that work has actually already started. And that's the idea with that is to reduce the mileage of the refuse vehicles, which obviously in turn then reduces fuel use and carbon emissions. Similarly with driver training, there's driver training available, which basically again can help to reduce fuel use and carbon emissions. Colleagues at Hoppost have already started discussions with some of the major manufacturers to trial some low emissions refuse vehicles. Obviously, we've got the particular issue that this is a rural district, so we need to make sure we've got some time to do the research on this. The refuse vehicles aren't due to be replaced till 2027, but nevertheless, it's useful to start to understand the technology and what types of technology are likely to work within our rural districts. And as vehicles come up for replacement, we wouldn't look to be replacing them early. That wouldn't make any sense to do that. We would look to see whether there's a business case for replacing those with electric vehicles. And then obviously alongside that, they would need to be charged. So we'd be needing to look at new charge points at Hoppost. There's only one charge point up there at the moment. So in terms of property, I mentioned this just now, audit of some of the main buildings to understand the works that would need to be undertaken to reduce carbon emissions. So as I say, that would focus on things like lighting, heating, any forms of insulation that would be required. We've got quite a lot of external lighting, so things like surface car parks, skate park, for example, and an external lighting survey. Again, that's to help us understand the potential costs involved with that switch to things like LED lighting. And the idea with those two bullet points is to come up with a costed programme of works for property and facilities. In terms of procurement, although that falls under the scope 3, so we do have longer, we want to start working on that already. So look to introduce a sustainable procurement policy. And as you know, we already have a team that works across numerous other local authorities. And so we can gain from their experience. Crawley, for example, have already introduced a similar sort of policy. And at the moment, we're using what's called proxy data to understand the carbon emissions from our contracts. So we'd want to work with suppliers to improve that data, basically. And that's something that we could start to do now. It's not something particularly easy. I've been involved with doing that before, and it's quite hard work. But the sooner we start, then we can start to get better data and work with our suppliers. And I mentioned in terms of the reduction in carbon emissions, the idea of offsetting. So we want to be able to understand what opportunities there might be on our own land. And that fits in with the wider agenda around biodiversity as well. So things like the Wilder Horsham project, we'd like to obviously ensure that the two dovetail together. We'd want to develop an offsetting strategy. I would imagine that members would be very keen to ensure that anything we were doing has a local benefit, and also look at tree management plan as well in terms of any opportunities we have for new planting. The expenditure for this short-term action plan, now some of that will obviously not all of that will fall within this current financial year. That does, we'd be looking at the transformation fund to help with that budget, and the main budget of the overall cost in terms of expenditure, 130,000. The main expenditure would be the audit, and that's something that we do want to complete within this current financial year. So the recommendations to Cabinet, for those of you that haven't actually seen the Cabinet report yet, haven't had the opportunity to look at it, as Philip mentioned, the aspirational target for 2030 carbon neutrality, and that focuses on those emissions that are within our direct control. Obviously, we need to balance that with the demands on the budget and staff resources in terms of delivering services, and then a longer term 2050 target for those in our indirect control. And as I mentioned, and just gone through the main points that are in a short-term action plan that take us through to about March 2022. But we will be reviewing where we are as part of the annual budget setting process. So we'll be looking again next autumn to see where we are, and anything that comes out from, say, for example, those audits, we'd be then building that into the budget where possible. So hopefully that gives you a quick overview of why we set where we're recommending the targets that we are, and how we're hoping to start taking the project forward immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Could you put us back? Thank you. Okay. James, make a point.
Thank you, Chairman. That's really interesting. Thanks for that. There's obviously a lot of work that's gone into it. It's a lot of money at the moment, particularly as we're looking, as you know, with an enormous budget shortfall. I suppose sort of two quick questions. Why 2030? And why not another 10 years and spread it over a longer period of time? And I've just popped the 16,000 tonnes that we produce as a council now into a carbon calculator that farmers use, and farmers can get paid for offsetting carbon, about £75 a tonne at the moment in the UK market. And it was £1.2 million a year we could pay to offset. So rather than spending the 33 million on bringing forward a lot of changes very quickly, why are we not just building in the cost of carbon into doing business, and instead of looking at sort of spending lots of money on big infrastructure changes, do we just not spend more money on offsetting? It seems like we're bringing forward lots of expenditure to hit that 2030 target. I'm not sure why that is the ambition, but then also why we are not looking more at offsetting when there is a market readily available for that already. I don't know who wants to answer that question, but I'd be very interested to know.
Do you want me to answer that, Philip?
Yes, please.
Okay.
I might make a comment, but yeah, please, Helen.
Okay. So I'll start with the 2030 targets. Yeah, it could be 2020, 2035. It could be 2031. I think that's the point that we've discussed previously. I think the idea with the 2030 target has come very much from a lead nationally as well, in terms of what I was saying previously around carbon budgets, and actually ensuring that we're not increasing our carbon budget over time. The longer that we're actually emitting carbon, the larger that budget is. So that's why it's set at 2030. It is aspirational, and it as I say, it's a little bit putting your finger in the air to a certain extent. But I think in terms of showing 2030, it demonstrates that we're serious about this particular agenda. It shows leadership, particularly when we then start to talk about, which is the next step of this project, really, is the district-wide emissions. And when we're starting to talk to other businesses within the district, we need to be able to demonstrate that we're putting our own house in order. In terms of offsetting, yeah, very controversial. I think if we were a private sector organisation, some are doing it. EasyJet, for example, just offset everything. I think members of the public become very cynical about that approach, personally. There is a place for offsetting, and we will need to use offsetting. But I think alongside that, we also need to ensure that we are reducing our energy use, for example, it will actually also help us save money, because electricity bills, gas bills are likely to continue to go up. So there is an argument around that. There is a balance, I think, with offsetting, and it is something that we will be looking at with other organisations, other councils as well. But what we would want to be doing is putting something in place that is able to bring benefits locally, and not just go into any old offsetting scheme that's already out there that actually may be distributing money elsewhere within the country. I suspect once we get into a discussion about offsetting, members would want that to have a co-benefit locally.
Which it could do. There's absolutely no reason why you couldn't, you know.
Yeah, can I just make a couple of comments, really to support what Helen said? I mean, we have, I don't want to sound like a government minister that we relied on the science, but I suppose we have been relying on the science, or at least more accurately relying on the experts, the expert consultants who've been advising us, whose understanding of these issues and the realistic options open to us as a council, what they are. And so we have taken a great deal of notice of what they have felt was a reasonable option, but an ambitious one. The trouble with offsetting is that a number of people see it almost as cheating. It's the, I know that's probably, a bit unfair, but it's not, as Helen said, it's not seen as the best environmental option. We will have to get into the business of offsetting, but certainly we don't want to see it from the word go as our favoured option. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, Helen.
Yeah, I think probably the other aspect to stress as well, James, is that figure that's been quoted is very much an estimate at the moment until we've done some more work, for example, on the audits for the property, so we can actually start to understand what that means. So also for leased buildings, if I touch on that, there is legislation already in place. So we'll already have to do work to our leased buildings to be able to lease them. By I think it's 2025. If they don't reach a certain standard in terms of carbon emissions, we won't be able to lease them. So I think there's that aspect, but more importantly, I think also coming back to members with much more detailed costings. This is very high level at the moment.
Okay, David.
Yes, thank you very much. I have to say to Philip, on a personal note, that I did appreciate that debate, and having initiated it, I'm very glad you've carried it on now, Philip, with these targets. And 2030, I think we mentioned, and I think that's great. I was quite encouraged by what we heard, because I think we're actually taking a lead as a council and being seen to show our residents and the people in the district that we take this very seriously. And at the moment, it's a hot topic, it's important, and it's got long-term implications for not only our generation, but the next few generations. I do think that the aspiration is great, and I hope that we are going to actually achieve our aspiration, as opposed to just use it as a term. And I think the plan that's been put forward is really positive, and I would support it fully. I think that offsetting is always a tricky one. I don't know enough about farming to know what the offsetting plan is there, but it seems to me that we can use both, and we'll have to use both at some stage or other. And I wouldn't rule it out, but I wouldn't rule it in at the moment as in terms of the plan that we've already got. Can I make a plea? And I'm not sure who to direct this to, but obviously this is going to need careful monitoring. Can I suggest that also the Scrutiny Committee is involved in this assessment and scrutiny of the plan as it unfolds, so that we can keep an open mind and a view about what's happening, because I think it's very important. It's one area we could actually be heavily involved with in this one. So on balance, I think it's great. Yeah, thank you very much, Philip. And I'd support the plan that's been put forward with the provision that we could look at offsetting at some stage. And I did note that green electricity would save us, I think you said, somewhere in the region of 800,000 at some stage or other in the future. And I just wonder whether we might start exploring that now. But I don't know what our contracts are, but I think it's something we should be doing. So thank you very much. Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you, David. Tim. You're mute.
Apologies. Yes, I've already seen this presentation and made some of my concerns known then. I mean, I agree with the aspirations of the plan, but following on from what James said, I'm very concerned about the cost implications of this, particularly with COVID and the effect that's going to have on our budgets for the next year, 2 years, maybe 3 years or more. It's a great deal of money, 33 million. And my question the last time, which didn't get answered, was when or if there was a likelihood of us being able to be cost neutral on this. In other words, the payback would equal the investment. And if we weren't going to get to cost neutral, because it would just be impossible, what the eventual capital cost would be. I don't know if anybody can answer that.
We can't. We're not in a position to be able to answer that until we've got the detailed work. Basically, these are high-level costs that the consultants have put together from very high-level kind of information. So it's not until we do things like the audits of some of the buildings that we'll actually be able to understand the costs and therefore the benefits and savings that flow from any work that will be completed, basically. And the same applies to things like the low-emission vehicles as well. It's not really until we get into the details that we'll have that sort of information available.
Just as a secondary question then, in your professional opinion, would it be possible for us to become cost neutral? I mean, have you experienced this before, or?
I think I'm less familiar in terms of the building stock. I mean, we've got such a diverse building stock, it's really difficult to comment on that, to be honest with you. I think with the fleet, that's probably more possible, but not necessarily with the refuse vehicles, because they're still likely to be quite expensive even when we get to 2027. I think costs of, say we were to go down electric vehicles for cars and vans, the cost of those is being driven down, coming down all the time. So I think that is more likely, particularly given that the maintenance cost for those types of vehicles is so much lower. But I think in terms of the buildings, it's much more difficult to comment. That's very much going to be on a case-by-case basis because they vary so considerably.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else got any comments they want to make? I just have one quick one. We've got a shared procurement framework with Crawley, and I think it's Mid Sussex. There's quite a lot of talk in your presentation about procurement. Would we have to either have our own procurement framework or persuade other councils to go the same route as we are in order to keep that in place?
So yes, we do. In fact, Mull Valley have joined as well. So the procurement team and the procurement manager, Joe Newton-Smith, has considerable experience already. As I say, Crawley have already introduced a sustainable procurement policy. So we can learn from the experience of that and also the implications in terms of the contracts as well, and whether that has any implications for the costs associated with contracts. So yeah, we would learn from that. We chose not to implement that policy at that time. For Crawley, it very much reflected a Crawley position. But nevertheless, we can learn, I think, from those other authorities. And the fact that we have that advantage that the procurement team, as you say, works across those different organisations.
Can I just make, Chairman, if you'll allow me?
Surely, can.
Just to pick up that point. We have at the moment a body that I sit on called the Inter-Authority Waste Group, which, as its name suggests, is made up of all the authorities in West Sussex, and we discuss waste issues and coordinate waste responses to waste issues. The discussions are going on at the moment with a view to turning the Inter-Authority Waste Group into, in effect, an inter-authority environmental group. Which will have terms of reference that are much wider than just waste issues, to cover questions of air quality and the issues we've been talking about this evening. Because what's quite obvious to me is that we do need to have a cooperative and joint working approach with other authorities, particularly with the County Council, and with the other districts and boroughs in West Sussex. So the direction of travel is to work towards more coordinated working with our colleagues in other local authorities. And as I've got the floor, Chairman, I wonder whether I could just say to David Skip, and I thank him for his kind comments, which are much appreciated. He was saying that we ought to have a scrutiny role, a continued role for assessment as we move forward. I agree. It's no good me sitting here and saying how, as publicly accountable elected politicians, we need to carry the public with us if we don't make, as an administration, we don't make a real effort to carry all members of the council with us. Because I think our response to this issue will be much more effective if we can work cross-party as a genuine. This should not be a party political issue, and I will certainly hope moving forward that we can work together as a council, and as an administration we can carry the council and all its members with us.
Thank you, Philip. I'm sure we will be receiving regular reports, and as these targets become more fixed, then we'll be able to measure the performance, and hopefully we'll be seeing excellent performance by the council over the coming years.
Chairman, can I just come in
Yeah, sure.
on that, because it was a question that I wanted to follow up. Obviously, when Leonard was chairman, he did do a lot of work about scrutiny, and one of the areas he obtained the government information about scrutiny, and obviously part of the scrutiny's remit is to be involved in ongoing or forthcoming policy, and this is one area that I would agree with Philip that in fact it should be across council, and I think it should be this committee that is involved in this, along with those who are developing the policy. So can I make a plea that in fact we are involved as a scrutiny committee in an ongoing way with this policy, so that we can have input into it? So rather than just review it once a year, we are actually actively involved. And I think that's probably what Philip was actually intimating and saying at that time.
Were words being put in your mouth, Philip, or?
No, obviously we'll have to decide the actual machinery for doing this. Of course we will. But my ambition is that we as an administration carry the council with us, because I really truly believe we'll be much more effective if we do that. And so obviously one of the ways in which we can do that is to have the active involvement of overview and scrutiny.
Thank you. And thank you for the report and everyone involved in that report. And I hope it's well received at Cabinet on Thursday. I'm sure it will be. Okay.
Much as I'd like to stay, Chairman, I have been a member of Overview and Scrutiny. Unless you need me, am I able to wish you well and move on?
Of course, yes. Thank you for your attendance for this item, Philip.
Right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Right. So item 6, finance and performance report. Jane?
Thank you, Chairman. Several things to draw your attention to in the finance and performance report this time. The first is, and it is good news, is that we've got our first real update on the corporate plan and the progress being made against it. And I was actually surprised quite how far it had gone, given the plan only sort of went live last autumn. The rest of the report, I'm afraid, isn't such good news. Obviously, we're looking at, or were looking at the end of month 4, a financial deficit of 5.6 million. There are some signs of improvement since then, in that particularly the parking income is starting to creep up. However, matters around leisure and matters around whether or not there'll be further lockdown measures outside the cities obviously remain of concern. Bear in mind when you look at the finances that it is the losses of parking and leisure that is 3/4 of what we've lost this year. So although we can look in the other areas, they're really not of such concern as getting parking and leisure moving. So I want to hear you're all going back to the gym regularly. Capital is better than it was at this time last year, but that's probably because Cabinet took some of the capital programme out, particularly the projects we thought we weren't going to deliver. The one thing that I will also draw your attention to that isn't really good news and yet is entirely inevitable given the situation we have with lockdown, it is the number of our indicators, performance indicators, that have dropped below target. Admittedly, mostly in leisure and culture, mostly in areas that we couldn't continue with, albeit that the council tax and business rates collection is of course down because people are not paying, and we are not able to undertake our full-scale recovery until the courts get back. Happy to take questions and will answer wherever I can and get you written answers where I can't. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Jane. Nigel, your hand up.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a question to you rather than to the Director. Tony, I believe in past it's thought appropriate for the Cabinet Member for Finance to attend these meetings when we talk about such financial and performance issues. Has the Cabinet Member been invited to attend this evening, and was he not able to do so?
I certainly didn't invite him. Obviously, he's very welcome to come. I don't know whether Democratic Services notified him of the meeting.
It seems to me that as we had the Cabinet Member for the Environment gave us a very good introduction and was able to comment on various issues in his portfolio, it would be entirely appropriate for the Cabinet Member for Finance to attend these meetings. And I would have thought he should have a regular invite to join us.
I'll take that up with him, Nigel, certainly.
Forgive me, Chairman, I think it is an invitation that should be extended to him, and the reasons for his non-attendance should be noted.
Okay. Brian.
It is not practice for the Cabinet Member of Finance to attend. The Director attends all the meetings and is able to totally and competently answer questions. And therefore, it would be inappropriate to take this matter up. As I say, I was Cabinet Member for Finance for over 4 years, and I know it well. And I don't see that the protocol should be changed. I don't think it would achieve anything. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Brian. Nigel, did you want to come back?
If I may, this is something that was discussed prior to this particular council coming into operation, and we did invite the Cabinet members. It's only appropriate. It's their portfolio. They should be talking about it, not leave it just to the Director, in my opinion, and I hope other members would agree with me.
Thank you. Brian, did you want to come back on that?
Yes, we did have a protocol. I don't know what happened to it, whereby once a year, every Cabinet Member would come to overview and scrutiny in order to respond to questions that were tabled before the meeting. I don't know if that procedure is going to continue or whether it's been permanently dropped. Perhaps the Director could clarify.
My understanding was that at one of our reviews or the other, the committee felt that they didn't need Cabinet members to come once a year regularly. They felt they didn't gain much from that, and I must admit there were a number of attendances where there were no questions to the Cabinet member. So overview and scrutiny decided not to. It is one of your functions as a committee to challenge Cabinet members. And obviously you need to bear in mind the time of and availability of Cabinet members as well. So I can well understand why Philip, on probably the biggest policy issue that he's ever had to deal with, was here tonight. A routine attendance, I think you'd obviously need to consider more carefully.
Okay. Can we draw a line under that one and move on? David.
Chairman, may I just make another point?
Okay.
It is totally correct that the Scrutiny Committee may call in a Cabinet member to explain a particular process or procedure or decision. So that is a lot different from the cabinet member being a sort of almost a, well, finance is discussed at every scrutiny meeting. So to suggest that the cabinet member should be at every scrutiny meeting when the director's already here has always been deemed inappropriate. But it is correct if there is a major event, and I would think what Councillor Circus came along here for highlighted the seriousness and the importance of what his portfolio is doing in that particular area. Thank you.
Okay. David.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just one final thought on that. I do remember that we had a cabinet member, a different cabinet member at each scrutiny meeting to look at their portfolio, and Nigel's right. But it seemed to me on this particular time, when we are in such a difficult situation because of COVID, perhaps we should ask the cabinet member for finance to come to a scrutiny meeting, just to give us the thinking of his portfolio. So I throw that one in, but I think we should be actually right, or it would be right for us to call in the finance member at some stage to talk about it. Can I ask a question of the director, particularly about the sports areas? We've got attendance at sports centres, attendance at the Capitol, attendance at Horsham Museum. Do you have attendance at Rookwood, which is a council-owned golf course, and which I presume has X number of thousands of pounds that it pays into us for its? Brian's shaking his head, so he's not going to. So
I'm afraid we don't have any attendance figures for Rookwood, but if it's a performance indicator you'd like to see, I can ask colleagues if we have any. But I don't actually know myself what is reported to Leisure on this, because I only really know of Rookwood from the financial point of view and between property and the people at Rookwood and the deal about the agreement over their payment of rent for Rookwood. It's not really a direct council service, which would make me think that's probably why we don't, but I can certainly ask Leisure if they have anything.
I was just intrigued as to how much it brought in, but leave that aside. The sports centre itself, the swimming, the leisure, the
pavilions,
the pools. Is that something that you cover as well? Because obviously we did make a payment to the leisure people for opening the pool. Do you have anything to report on that?
No, Shane Adams left because it was him who did the deal on that. So an agreement was reached about what they would pay, or rather wouldn't pay us this year, because the agreement always was that the Places Leisure would pay us money for running the leisure centres. Obviously this year, you know, they've lost out. An agreement was reached about that. And as far as I know, that's the agreement, unless anything changes. The big concern, obviously, is something going to change again?
But we don't know. Perhaps I'm going offline. We don't know quite how much we had to pay out to them as a company to get themselves started.
I don't know. No, not off the top of my head. But I expect I can get a confidential briefing round you if you'd like one.
It'd be very nice to know. Thank you.
Okay. Matt.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a question for the Director of Corporate Resources. And it does require a bit of hindsight. I mean, prior to COVID-19, were you happy with the level of risk that we had in our income? So in terms of parking making quite a significant proportion, are you comfortable with that? Because it's quite a cyclical stream of income, whereas council tax is not. I would imagine it is probably more sustainable or more solid? Are you comfortable with that in a normal time? I appreciate we're not in normal times at the moment, but if this were a more normal recession.
We were always vulnerable to recession. And we're vulnerable to recession in a number of areas of our budget. We've always been vulnerable in parking income. We're always vulnerable in planning income, because as soon as you hit a recession, planning and building control income goes down because people stop building. We're always vulnerable in council tax. We're vulnerable to extra costs of homelessness. What we hadn't taken into account was that the country could lock down. And I've been involved in emergency planning for probably 15 years. And although I've done a number of emergency planning exercises across a number of different councils that involve terrorism and shootings and all sorts of things, and although I'd sat on any number of SARS type, this could be a global pandemic, I had never heard that we might have a lockdown. So that wasn't knowledge that was out in the sector. And I think if it had been out widely, I would have known, because I've been involved so much. So in our risk assessments that we took when I wrote the Section 25 statement in February, I did not take into account the possibility of a full lockdown, because I've never heard of it before.
Yeah, no, I completely appreciate that. You know, that is a massive level of tail risk that basically no one would have been able to see. With this in mind, do you think going forward over the next 3 years, it would be sensible of the council to increase council tax at a higher rate than we have in the past?
I would always encourage the councillors to increase council tax at a higher rate, but it is a councillor decision in the end. I can't imagine a Section 151 officer that didn't say push it as far as you can, albeit people will find it hard to pay, but we do have the council tax reduction scheme to help people who genuinely can't pay.
Okay, thank you, Chairman.
Okay. Brian.
You mentioned my favourite council tax. So some of you will remember for the past 6 or so years, I wanted to increase it to a little bit higher levels and to build up our reserves for things that we don't expect. Gosh, there came COVID. Anyway, on Rookwood, those of you who've been on this committee for a year, and certainly those of you who've been on it for 5 years, will know that Rookwood has been a bad debtor. My expression, the officers don't like using it, and a defaulter. And Rookwood, in fact, managed to persuade the council early last year to review down their contract, and they still remained, in my opinion, a bad debtor. So therefore we had to have a dead asset there. And hence Rookwood came up on the housing project idea. I noticed an email just now from council where they've listened to obviously these concerns from citizens about building on Rookwood, and I do ask you to have a good look at this email, because I think it looks like the officers might have come up with a proposal that might satisfy everybody. And let's not forget the default position is, and Jane is doing a great job and putting on a good face, but we've taken a hell of a hit. And in order to protect our valuable resources and also our valuable non-statutory services, we need to fill those holes very quickly. And things like Rookwood, the drill hall and the running track will help us, all of which are non-performers. And the running track, by the way, for those of you who have not studied it in great depth, is used by multitudes of people who don't live in the district and thus don't contribute via council tax to its upkeep. But I think by looking at things like that, we get a bit of hurt, but within a year or 2 or 3, we will be back in the very sound position that Jane and the officers have kept us in for many years. And by the way, we're no different from any other council. We're probably I think a lot better off than most councils. But Rookwood is a great disappointment. I mean, it's a lovely golf course and all the rest of it, but they just don't seem to have been able to push the membership up to warrant its continuation. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Brian. Nigel.
Thank you, Chairman. It was about Rookwood I wanted to just mention, and Councillor Donnelly preempted me. I remember when I sat as deputy or whatever it is to Jonathan Chowan for his leisure portfolio for a number of years. I remember that it was a frequent story that there were difficulties with the profitability and viability of running Rookwood. So we were hearing from the lessees. And I was interested to hear from Councillor Donnelly that there was a further rent reduction last year or earlier this year. It is important upon us to use our assets as best as we can do. And it's no point in having a facility which is not being used to its full. And so I concur with that. But if I may come back on the list, I have another point on some of the figures on the information we have.
Did you want to do that now?
Yes, if I may.
Yeah.
A couple of things. In terms of, there was a comment earlier on about the payment that, or the financial arrangements with our friends Places for Leisure on the 4 leisure facilities. And I think we're putting in a cost of about 2.5 million. Is that right? And there's or it's costing us 2.5 million. I'm not quite sure. I think we're going to get a confidential note as to what the capital sum that we've had to pay Places for Leisure to reopen. And it says here, amounts are within Sport England framework and in common with other authorities. I wonder whether or not the director could just explain to us what that means about Sport England.
I think I'll have to get you a written note on that one. I'm afraid I don't know anything about the Sport England framework. I do know there is some talk at the moment that government are getting to a point at which they're saying, how are we going to pay you to help out leisure, rather than are we going to pay you to help out leisure? So that there is some optimism that we might get something, whether that's something to do with it, but I will need to confirm with Adam exactly what that means and get back to you.
It'd be quite helpful because obviously it would be nice if we could get some money back from central government for that. Could I ask just another question? We've got some figures on the capital programme for Peerys Place car park. This is a car park that's brand spanking new, only been open about a year or so. Have we got trouble with the car park lifts already there? And if so, aren't they part of the defects liability period and down to the contractor?
I think anything in the capital programme is just the finishing off of the previous year, and I'm not aware of any issues with the lifts, and being the director responsible, I would be aware if there were any. Well,
we've got £75,000 there, Director, which is coming in this year. This is a year after it's been opened. I mean, you don't usually have a defect. You don't usually have any retentions for a specific item of construction. You might have it on the whole job, but you won't have it on a lift or a staircase or something like that. I'm just fascinated that it looks as though we've got problems with the lift. You're telling me we don't have problems with the lift? You're muted.
I'm not aware of any problems with the lift, but I will get Brian to answer you. This is a property matter, not a parking matter, which would be why I don't know about it.
Okay. Finally, can I just comment, Chairman, that I've noted the director's influence on the description of his or her officers with regard to their enthusiasm for anticipating expenditures. However, there is one point. If we go to one page, one of the portfolio holders has not responded to information. I wonder which that request for information. I wonder which one that was. No budget monitoring or forecasting was received from one budget holder. Are you able to say which budget portfolio that was?
No, these matters are dealt with through the officer's side, through the directors, back to the individuals concerned. As a senior leadership team, we are highly committed to getting all responses in, and we do chase very hard, and Adam and Barbara are as committed to this as I am, so they do deal with officers concerned.
So you could tell us which budget portfolio holder that was, can you?
It's not something I'm prepared to talk about individual officer performance in a public meeting.
Thank you.
Okay, Francis.
Thank you, Chairman. I wanted to ask the Director about Appendix E, the annual governance statement. This partly follows on from the discussion earlier about whether Cabinet members should be attending scrutiny or not. There is currently a lot of overlap between the PDAGs and, the Policy Development Advisory Groups and the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. That is due to be reviewed by the Governance Committee. And I understand there's a target date on here for the 30th of September, but governance isn't meeting until during October. So I just wondered if we have a new date for that target, please.
Yeah, it'll be, I will be changing it to the end of the financial year. It is most likely to be before Christmas. And I'll tell you what I've done. We have some graduates who work for us from the National Graduate Scheme. They like project work, and they particularly like project work with councillors because it gives them an opportunity to see part of the office they don't normally see. So I have allocated that piece of work to them. Any of you who've been to PDAGs this month will have possibly seen Lucy Melvin sitting there with Democratic Services. She's helping Democratic Services, who are a little bit short-staffed at the moment, but she is also looking at gaining knowledge for this project. So the new graduate starts on the 28th of September. As soon as he is in, they will start working together on talking to councillors, and we've yet to work out exactly the best way of talking to councillors, because we can talk to them in PDAGs or in overview and scrutiny, but then there's always a bit of a group influence. So it might be we want to look at it in different ways as well, maybe as political groups, maybe doing a questionnaire. We haven't worked out the finest detail of it. So the graduates will do the research. They will then report to Governance Committee. Overview and scrutiny will obviously be involved, so you can put in your views from an overview and scrutiny perspective. But I would expect the bulk of the work to be being done in October and November of this year. Our new graduate actually has a politics degree, so I'm sure it's going to be of particular interest to him.
Thank you. That sounds it's a very good opening project for the next generation of council leaders and officers.
Excellent. Josh, you had your hand up just now. Did you?
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. I was just going to say something briefly on fly tipping. I understand the higher incidence of fly tipping in these times. And actually, I also want to congratulate the council and Councillor Circus for their oversight in the successful prosecution of Mr. Johnson recently. I think that was a job well done in creating public awareness and getting witnesses to come forward. I also know that there's been quite a large element of publicity surrounding this, but I just feel we can do much more in deterrence. I think we all know that there's increased social pressure works, whether this is asking for more witnesses to come forward or encouraging greater activity online or through social media, whether that's talking about fines that have been issued and particular individuals. We could get the local press more on side to promote the message of how socially unacceptable this is. We can introduce greater signage, more cameras. We could, well, perhaps not now, but in the future, create marshals to patrol hotspots, or even, as I believe happens in some areas, certainly I think Sheffield's one example, name and shame those caught through publishing their names and addresses online. That's only obviously for those that have been successfully prosecuted, along with details of their refusals to pay the initial fines. But I think this has been highly successful. They're just some of the things I think we could be looking at going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Okay, if no one has got any further comments on that, item on the agenda. Shall we move on to the work programme? Which is on page 55. Can I just, there's a couple of task and finish groups out there. The one that Brian was running on parking numbers on new development, I think it ought to be close to finishing. Is it possible to convene a meeting of that to get a report out and get that one over the line?
Well, it was decided some time back that it wouldn't be appropriate to have a final meeting like that of great confidential matters via Zoom. But I suppose if you really wanted us to do something, we could. Or we could get a final paper together and take it from there.
Well, I think the council generally is sort of comfortable about having confidential matters being discussed over Zoom. I haven't seen any suggestion that using Zoom has stopped us exploring confidential matters. So
no, the Standards Committee subcommittees on complaints is not operating because of the concern about the sensitivity of such things being discussed on Zoom, and it felt some of the matters on this task and work group might be the same. But as I say, you know, if you would like me to organise a paper to be finalised, we can do that.
That would be great if that can happen.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. And David, your task and finish group.
Yes.
I can see that obviously in the current climate, it must be very difficult to make any progress on that. And I just wonder what we should be doing to either to progress it or to maybe put it in cold storage for a while. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, my view is that we can't come to any conclusions that we were looking. We were looking at the health services locally, but I think with COVID and the fact that there may be further lockdowns or further problems, I think it should be put on cold storage. I like that term, or put in cold storage at the moment, because we can't really come up with anything positive until all of this is over, and then we can see what we're left with.
Okay.
I don't know what other members feel in the group about that.
Does anyone who's on that task and finish group got any views? Brian?
Yeah, I see David's problem. It is very difficult. He may have the correct solution. I sit on a unit that works with the local medical group, and we've been trying to get some things done there, which has not been very successful. Just in passing, the one that affects so many of us wherever we are is, of course, the doctors are not to be seen, and it's very hard to, actually physically get in with them. I don't know about Horsham, but we've got a great bunch down there, but it is causing problems, and people with serious matters, and like they need their blood taken and told to come back in a week. I mean, it's just crazy, but it is difficult. Everyone's got problems, and I think what David said is possibly correct.
Okay. We have got one suggestion for a new group, but it's come from Mike Croker, who unfortunately couldn't make it tonight. So not quite sure where to go on that one. My inclination is that we postpone discussion on that until the next meeting, and hopefully Mike can be at that meeting. But I'm happy to take an alternative approach if people want me to. Okay, so let's postpone that until the next.
Chairman, my hand's up.
Sorry, Brian. Yeah.
I agree with you, Chairman. In any case, the decision was made. All of us were quite keen to get into this at some stage. In fact, I think it was at the first meeting last year, gosh, amazing how time flies. But then because there was the LCWIP group going ahead, which was appeared a far bigger and a far more effective group than ourselves, we decided that we would delay ours or just put it on the shelf, awaiting the outcome of the LCWIP's report. They do seem to take a long time. I don't know why, but the report, I believe a draft report now has been received by the Horsham Town Centre PDAG, as Mike says in his paper. And so thus, hopefully, we might be able to find out whether that report has done the work for us, which is what we thought would happen, because we didn't want to duplicate work, or whether that report does not give all the answers that we wish. So as you suggest, and I think you've made the right suggestion, if we defer it, and it's possible before the next meeting, we could get this draft report to have a look at and to see if it actually meets our needs, or whether we need to set up our own review. Yeah, it's quite an interesting one. I notice under Mike's evidence factor, he talks about money that's been spent on the COVID cycling walking strategy, and I really don't believe you want to get into that area, because I think most of us who read the papers know that it's been a total disaster, and in fact it's been closed in many occasions. I heard somewhere, it wasn't in Horsham this last week, where was it Horsham? There's somewhere an ambulance with blue lights got stuck in one of these new cycling walking schemes and couldn't get out. And that is happening all over the place. Anyway, I agree with what you recommend, Chairman.
Thank you, Brian. Nigel.
I also agree with the proposal, and as regards Councillor Donnelly's comment about the Albion Way pop-up cycle lane, I suspect by the next time that we meet, we'll have a little more evidence of how that has been received by our local residents. So I think it'd be wise to leave it until the next time we meet.
Okay, thank you. Ruth.
I don't believe that our COVID cycle lane has been closed on numerous occasions. I have been down there on numerous occasions and to look for the gridlock that I've been hearing about. And so far I've failed to find any gridlock on any occasion. There are quite a lot of videos around. There's no gridlock. There has been some queuing. That's not a surprise. Most of the time the traffic's been flowing freely. When the West Sussex traffic light engineers were down there at the morning rush hour the other day, they weren't seeing any gridlock either. There are not many cyclists, but obviously it only goes in one direction, doesn't go from anywhere to anywhere at the moment. But those cyclists who are there are using it, unlike the places where there's no lane, where a lot of people are riding on the pavement. And there have been a number of very positive comments as well. So I'm reluctant to allow the committee to go away with an unchallenged view that the whole thing's an unmitigated disaster.
Just a quick one, Jim, and I wasn't suggesting that ours was a total disaster. I was just saying, and I did say, if you read the newspapers, you will see there's multitudes of disasters all over the country, that these schemes have been put in without a proper consultation. And we had one suggested for Pulver as well. And I won't tell you how many hundreds of emails I had against it, and I won't bore you with the details, but proper consultations have got to be done with all these things. Otherwise, it's always a recipe for disaster. Thank you.
I think there's always some organised kickback on this. There are some supposed grassroots groups set up that aren't anything of the sort. There are some very dubious claims being made. I think you should check into the actual facts before you believe all of this. And of course, one of the advantages of these things is that they are actually very good for emergency services because they give emergency services a clear path through.
The reports in the Telegraph are undoubted.
Okay, Billy.
I'm sorry. I made the mistake of driving to Sainsbury's the other day from Southwater, and the queue went back over the bridge, back nearly up to the past the Needles. So it was shocking. So I just thought I'd relay my experience of the cycle lane.
What time was that, Billy?
That was at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Okay. Well, I think
it's a shame because I'd love it to succeed, but it's not appropriate.
Right. So we've decided to defer that item till next meeting, and I'm sure we'll all have some ammunition to bring to use in that discussion. So let's move on to item 8, forward plan. Has anyone got any comments they want to make on the forward plan? Billy, is your hand still up? Or
No, my hand was up for bikes, not for this.
Okay, thank you. Right, so we just note this forward plan and move on. And the last item is urgent business. I don't think there is any urgent business. No.
Not that I know of.
Sorry?
I haven't heard of any, Chairman, and I think I would know. I
think we'd know. Okay, well, thank you all for your attendance, and have a good night.
Thank you, Chairman. Same to you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Chairman.